And let's admit everybody.
Start listening to music, so I guess that's the one benefit of being at Starbucks.
Oh, yes, you get a little background music. We
Exactly.
cannot hear that at all. So,
Okay, well now I totally feel much better about it. Much better about it. Yeah, I don't see. I was checking to see if I can figure out how to create a poll. So we may end up doing the thing in the chat you mentioned.
that's
'Cause,
fine.
yeah, I thought it would be an option on the bottom, but they just updated Zoom. Like I just downloaded an update like 2 days ago, and so the bottom is even somewhat different than what it was a few days ago when I was on it. So
Yes, I so appreciate Zoom staying ahead of the curve, but for those of us who struggle with the curve at all, the constant updates are not helpful. Moving controls should be like a foul of some kind. So, well, I want to welcome those who are joining us this morning. My name is Dale Suggs, and next to me is my beloved wife, Shelley. I am the director of Beloved Compassion Network, and Shelley is our co-director. And we are an organization utterly committed to helping individuals and organizations and communities learn compassion and compassionate action as a way of life. And as part of our journey has been connecting with Christopher Carter and Seth Shane, who have been doing work in how compassion and compassionate action can be both the motivating and the sustaining force behind dismantling systemic racism, everywhere from just recognizing our privilege to engaging structures of oppression. And so we're so happy that Christopher and Seth can be with us this morning. And I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to them. For the next 2 hours, we look forward to what you have to share with us.
So thank you all for being here. We are excited to share a bit about what we do and then to entertain some questions that you might have about what we do, or clarifications or curiosities. And so we'll begin with our presentation and then end with a Q&A. And so we'll begin by introducing ourselves. So I'm Dr. Seth Shane, and I have a PhD in practical theology, and my emphasis is on spiritual formation, compassion formation, and race students. So I'm particularly interested in racial resilience, using compassion as a foundation for engaging a sustainable anti-racist way of life. And then I'm also an ADHD executive function coach at the Hallowell Tadaros ADHD Center, which is based in Seattle. And I'm actually in San Diego. And then this is my family. They are a big part of what sustains me. And I spend most of my time taking care of my daughters and co-parenting with my wife. So we have a 3-year-old and a 9-month-old. And it's a lot of work, but very rewarding. So that's enough about me to get us going. Christopher, I'll hand it over to you.
yeah, so my full title, I guess, is Reverend Dr. Christopher Carter. I'll start by pointing out the picture that is Isaiah's 3rd birthday. We were at Legoland, which is like the first time we kind of went to a theme park that he actually really wanted to. Well, I should say he had a very clear idea of what he wanted to do in the park, and it was almost like going to a park for the first time. It was just really fascinating in terms of just trying to follow him around and really pay attention to his interests. But that's a picture of my wife and his son, Gabrielle. Fun fact, Isaiah and Belle, so Seth's oldest daughter, so look at this picture right here, are the same age. They were born on the same day in the same hospital. So we were across the hall from each other while our wives were in labor. So it's pretty crazy. Their due dates were not the same, but just how God works sometimes. So it was pretty cool. So my PhD is in social ethics with emphasis on Black theology and ethics, environmental ethics, and food studies. Pretty much the through line through all of my work is race, which has led me to the work that Dr. Shane and I do. I'm an associate professor of theology at University of San Diego. I'm a Methodist clergy person. I'm the lead pastor of the Loft at Westwood UMC in Los Angeles. And so, yeah, that's a little bit about me. Just so you guys kind of know a little bit about who we are, but we are going to pivot, talk a little bit about like essentially why we created racial resilience is because we fundamentally believe we need a new approach to thinking about and doing and teaching people how to be anti-racist, right? So both Seth and I are called to do anti-racist work out of our moral commitment to foster relationships across difference. This is a commitment that we've had most of our lives is manifested in different ways, but it's strengthened during the development of our own particular relationship. As we grew closer together, we realized that our relationship was not only unique, but that we had stumbled into actually different ways of being in a relationship with each other that we felt like could translate into helping others learn how to apply some of the skills we can learn in graduate school just in our own lives. Essentially, both Seth and I, we met at graduate school at Claremont School of Theology. We went to progressive institutions that were inclusive, and that was a big reason why we wanted to go to those institutions, right? Like we were very fascinated, interested in learning how to apply, one might say, the spiritual path of Jesus, that path of modesty and compassion, in very liberatory ways. So I was drawn to Claremont because it was progressive. I went to work at a progressive churches in Compton and in Torrance. Seth was there initially to do New Testament research and to really think about ways in which the Bible could be liberatory and transformative for different communities. And really, despite our desire for inclusion and justice, what we experience and what we realize is that even those progressive institutions, that white supremacy really influenced the ways in which those institutions were still thinking, acting, and behaving, and unfortunately they influenced in the ways that those institutions didn't quite necessarily know or understand. And so Seth, I'll turn it over to you to share a little bit about your experience.
So for me, where I kind of woke up to the reality of racism in the United States was during my time in AmeriCorps in my early 20s. I was in AmeriCorps National Civilian Community Corps. I wanted to perform some civil service to serve my country was what I felt was important at that time in my life. And I thought this was the way to do it. And this is where I kind of woke up to race, but also saw how white saviorism really works and was a part of a white saviorism service project. But I didn't know that really until years later when I started studying race and was reflecting on the situation and realized, wow, okay, this is a time in my life when I was trying to do something good, but was engaged in a white saviorist approach. And so I was transformed. So our first project round was in Baltimore at an inner city school. And our project round was 3 months. And so we were at the school for 3 months. And the school was all Black kids. And we were, as you can see, a mostly white team. And we were there to just help out in whatever ways the teachers wanted. And so I was a part of second grade classroom. And so kids at that age, really just love you pretty much instantly. And I quickly developed a rapport with them. And so we were all lined up to go out to recess one day. And one of the kids looked up at me with this kind of quizzical look on his face and said, "Mr. Shane, are you white?" And so before I could answer, another kid jumps in and said, No, he ain't white. He's light skinned. And so I didn't know what to do with this. I knew very little about race at that time in my life and was kind of saved by the bell because we started going out to recess. And so just kind of let it stand. But later reflecting on that, I realized how much these kids know about race at an early age, and that these kids in second grade knew more about the way race functions than I did in my early 20s. And that he already knew about evaluation based on skin color, an evaluation of your personhood based on skin color, and jumped in to protect me because I was a part of his group. He liked me and I had developed this rapport with him. And so this was his way of being inclusive to me. And I didn't have the language to express this until much later in my life, until I really started studying race and racism. And then the other experience was we got to school in the morning, and the principal met us at the door and said, we need you to go around to all the doors and not make sure none of the kids get out. We don't know where it happened, but there's been a murder and the body's on the playground. And as it happened, I was assigned the door to the playground, and the body was on the playground on the kickball field between the pitcher's mound and home plate. Didn't really know how to make sense of that. I wondered how many kids had already seen this murdered person on the way to school, and that no child should have to deal with this, should ever have to see something like this. And as I've told this story, it seems more and more mild because of the prevalence of gun violence and what children have to deal with now over the years. And that's sort of a kind of a sickening feeling is what that's given me over the years. And so this was the reality that these kids had to deal with. Nothing I was ever exposed to as a child where I grew up in Nebraska. And I didn't know what to do with that. And then the project round ended and we moved on. And so stuck in this white saviorist framework where I was transformed, and not even because they were trying to give us some transformative experience, but because I was curious and open to it. But we were there to, save these kids from these poor children from their destitute life or whatever. It was a pretty racist reflecting back on it. And so that's where I kind of woke up to the reality of race and racism and how white saviorism works.
Yeah, so my particular experience, thank you for sharing stuff. And this is the first time you've shared that story where you've mentioned the increase in gun violence. I mean, this is the first time we've done this after Uvalde, especially. And, that's so sad and depressing. So just something for us to continue to think about, actually, even as we're doing this work. And so for me, so that's what Seth experienced in AmeriCorps. For me, when I began to understand we needed a new way of thinking about anti-racism, maybe it started during my post-PhD coursework. So I am what's called a Forum for Theological Exploration Fellow. This is the predominant funding arm for Black scholars of religion and theology. And so they have these different workshops and camps and retreats that we go to. And one of these particular retreats, we had a really racist encounter with a funder who essentially, because he was a white man married to an Asian woman, made a lot of assumptions about what he knew about race and racism, and was basically making a lot of racist comments around the kinds of failures that he's seen within the Black community and why they do the funding work they do in those particular spaces. And what I realized is in the middle of this conversation, while it was going on and things were getting heated, I was responding very differently than my peers. Not that I wasn't angry, I was very frustrated with what was talking about. But I noticed that I was applying some of my contemplative studies capacities I had learned of noticing what's going on and setting it aside to tend to it later, but staying focused on, in fact, the meeting was to try to get funding from this person. That was the key, is to try to, how can we learn about getting funding to help fund our research? Because we're poor grad students and, we need money. And so what I realized in the debrief of this session, when I'm talking with the leaders at FTE and talking with my friends and peers and colleagues, is the way in which they wanted to solve the problem was was venting and anger and say, okay, this person should be fired. And all that stuff, is helpful. There's a way you need to vent. There's a way in which this person needs to be held accountable. But they had not talked about the importance of the skills that they needed to be able to not only navigate those spaces, but also how do we respond and tend to the stuff that comes up when we encounter those racial microaggressions as people of color, right? Like, how do we navigate this space in ways that can not allow us to be drugged down to lower than we know we want to be with respect to our own humanity and how we engage others. And so I felt like this was crucial, and it's something crucially important if we want to talk about and do anti-racism in ways that are sustainable for people of color, because we deal with racism on a daily basis. And so in a sense, the problem was giving these institutions and the people who lead them to see how, despite their best intentions to be more inclusive, that in some ways, institutions such as one we're trying to get funding for, which I will not name, a lot of them were using white supremacist logics to that they believe to be dismantle white supremacy because they avoided doing any kind of internal work to see the ways in which white supremacy honestly has shaped their worldview. And people of color hadn't done the internal work, or were not doing the internal work that I felt was important for us to heal and to be healed in the midst of doing this difficult work. And so what we like to do is have a kind of an example of what we're talking about when we talk about doing this, the importance of doing this internal work. And so Seth, I'll let you share a little bit about what we're going to be doing, and I will change the screen when we get to there and put the link in the chat for the Mentimeter, okay?
So one of the places we start is with all of the stuff that comes up for us when we talk about race and racism. And we, most of the time, can't bring that into conversations about race and racism. So we want to start by naming some of that. So what we're going to do here is a practice we call the Whiteboard Practice. And so we want you to navigate to menti.com and answer the question. You can enter it the 3 times. And we're going to generate a live word cloud together. So your answers will be anonymous. And so we want you to think about what feelings, thoughts, emotions come up for you when you know you're going to talk about race, racism, or white privilege. And so navigate to Mentimeter.
Seth, can you see the question with the website and link and stuff? Okay, cool.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure people actually can see it. Perfect.
And so the link and code are at the top of the screen here. And when you're there, you can give up to 3 answers and then return back to this screen and you'll be able to see the word cloud generate. If that's unclear, please feel free to ask a question. You can do it through the chat or just unmute yourself if you prefer. And you can follow the link in the chat that Christopher just put into the chat. You can click on that and follow the link as well. And as people continue to provide answers, notice which ones resonate with you. You know, the ones you've entered, and then maybe some that you haven't. So thank you all for continuing to enter your responses and providing a really generative word cloud here. So this is what's present for all of us, for this group, when we talk about race and racism. Most of the time, people try and solve, other anti-racism programs try and solve this by saying, you know, leave that at the door. Don't bring it in. Like, this stuff isn't welcome here. Just bring your rational intellectual mind and we're going to solve anti-racism this way. And it doesn't really work. That's what we see time and again. This is an ineffective way to really address racism, because racism brings up all of this stuff. And most programs don't know what to do with all of this stuff. And so our approach kind of flips it on its head and says, well, what we need to do is bring this into the learning space, because the way we understand our internal worlds is that all of the stuff that comes up for us are potential catalysts for sustaining an anti-racist way of life. At the core of each of these emotions and inner stirrings is a wisdom that needs to be understood. All of these different feelings are trying to help us in some way when we take the time to understand their wisdom. And that's really counterintuitive, right? So it may make sense how empathy is trying to help us, or listening can help us. But how is anxiety trying to help us? How is the desire not to offend someone, or the shame, or these other more uncomfortable emotions, how are they trying to help us? And so that's what our process does, is allow us to get to the root of that and to understand what these feelings are trying to do for us. And so we created racial resilience because we know that transformation is only possible when people are able to bring their whole selves into these trainings. Because anti-racism asks you to both learn and unlearn truths about ourselves, about others, and about our country that some of us may have never considered before. And we need time to unpack that and to really take that learning into our whole selves.
Sorry, I was muted. I was like, oh, shoot. I've only been doing this for 3 years. They don't know that by now. So essentially, again, we know white supremacy is essentially the big, huge obstacle we're trying to overcome. And the other obstacle we're trying to overcome is, how do we create an approach, or how do we develop an approach that allows us to bring our whole self into the space, that recognizing the things that come up for us, the parts of us that are reactive, need to be tended to, and also have a kind of wisdom for us to glean from. So how did things get this bad, right? With especially particularly when we're looking at like progressive organizations that have tried to at least not be racist or to be anti-racist in the past. There's a couple of things that we want to suggest that led us to the point where we are at right now. The first is kind of recognizing that white supremacy is so pervasive that we tend to interpret our world through the white racial frame. And by this, we mean that even those of us who are well-intended, right, in terms of our interactions with others, our interactions with ourselves, and the way in which we interpret the news and the world around us, this is done substantially through what, again, Joe Keegan calls white racial frame, or depending on where you're from, it could be even a colonial frame, one way to look at it as well, if you're not from the States. Essentially, it tells us it's an orientation, it's a way to interpret the events that happen to us, or an experience that happen to us, that normalize the structure that we encounter. One of the best examples I tell that I think are helpful for thinking about the impact of the white racial frame is just the way we talk about schools, and the way we talk about some schools as good schools and some schools as bad schools. If you think about the racial makeup of those quote unquote good schools or bad schools, the location of those quote unquote good schools or bad schools, all this stuff is often wrapped up in a kind of racialized politics, right? Because we have to remember, part of the reason we even have the challenges of integration really centered around who our kids would go to school with, right? And so that's one way to think about the pervasive reality of white racial frame, and how it's even tied to our language about education in ways that we perhaps haven't even thought about. Now, how did it get so bad when it seemed like we had made so much progress, right, with respect to dealing with race and racism and racist terrorism? One thing that we want to suggest is that a lot of the momentum after the civil rights legislation was signed, especially after you have the assassination of so many civil rights leaders, begins to die down. And again, to be clear, this is not just dying down because people don't want to do any work. It's because for people of color, they're being attacked and murdered. So that's one hand you have to think about it. And on the other hand, there's this assumption, we suggest, that after we have these legal remedies of racism, we think, okay, it's technically illegal, right, to segregate. It's technically illegal to deny people services or goods because of their race. We buy into the notion that a kind of legal fix is going to be sufficient. You combine that with the idea that we think, well, most people are really good and not intentionally racist. And if we make it illegal, that should solve a lot of the problem. What we recognize is that this approach is really rooted in a kind of racial trauma that we call racial exceptionalism, which we'll define if you're interested in signing up our program later on. But essentially, the shorthand version of it is it's this idea of thinking that racism exists out there in the world, but it doesn't exist within us or within our communities, right? This kind of failure to do an inward turn. Also, people at this period of history really often have a fixed understanding of racism. This idea that racism is people, in the Klan, for instance, right? Like they thought, or calling someone the N-word, or calling someone out of their name. And what we recognize now is that racism is always being re-articulated. Racism is dynamic. It's finding ways to essentially use dog whistle kind of terms to really say something racist without being as specific as we might have initially thought. Now, despite these long-term shortcomings of this particular kind of civil rights era approach, we can take heart that there have been and continue to be people like yourselves who at some point realize that what we are doing is not enough, that we need to actually have a kind of change in the approach of talking about and thinking about teaching anti-racism. And some of that we think, in our experience, based on the work that we do, is a response to the events of the last, really, I would honestly, we could start with the election of Barack Obama, but particularly with the election of Donald Trump, with the summer of 2020, with the murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor, or even the rhetoric that's attached with January 6th. We see this obvious increase in the ways in which white supremacist rhetoric is shaping our politics, our social institutions, when we are confronted with the reality that we must actively resist white supremacy, or else we will suffer from the consequences of policies that dehumanize people. Right. And that's essentially where we are right now with even talking about the Supreme Court. If you're paying attention to the policies that have been passed, we are on a fast track to a lot of harm. And so we know we need a new approach to the way we see people, the way we try to humanize people, and the way in which we engage people. Right.
So if white supremacy is the problem, then how do we dismantle it? And so there are three general approaches that can be offered. We find one of them useful. So the first is escaping, and this is the kind of colorblind racism that, I don't see color, I treat everybody equally, or someone else's color doesn't influence how I view them. So I think most of us are familiar with this approach. It has dominated since the signing of the Civil Rights Bill, the King of the Creation, and it's been sort of the major view of racism since. And it's not a great way to approach ending racism. The second is defending the status quo. And this is what King referred to as the white moderate in his letter from Birmingham jail. And that is, you want change, but you want change in your terms. And want to protest in ways that make them feel comfortable, that don't really challenge us at all. Protest at a time when it's convenient. And doesn't inconvenience me much, that kind of idea. Also insufficient. This is what King was saying many years ago. I was trying to figure out how many decades. I can't do the math in my head that quickly. I'm not great at math. The third is confronting it. And this is what we choose to do. We choose to confront racism. And so it's why we created racial resilience. So the lure of white supremacy and the foundational assumptions on which it is built remain dominant. And we believe the best and most sustainable way to dismantle these dominant forces is a holistic, compassion-based approach to our understanding of structural racism. So we must see ourselves as part of the racist structure we're trying to dismantle. White supremacist thinking has impacted all of us. So the threads of our lives are woven into the fundamentally racist fabric of society. So we need a way of life that allows us to attend to our own racial trauma, one that allows us to cultivate an empathic, compassionate response to the racial trauma of others. When we take this kind of humanizing approach, we gain the information needed to discern an anti-racist, compassionate action that centers the needs of those who are suffering. This compassion-based approach is what sets racial resilience apart from other anti-racism trainings. And there are three basic principles that guide racial resilience. So the first is that we attend to the trauma of racialization. And the second is self-care and healing the wounds of others. And then the third is that we're committed to an inclusive approach. And so the first one is that we attend to the trauma of racialization. And so we do this using compassion. So what is compassion? Well, it's defined in a lot of different ways, depending on who you talk to, and there's a lot of experts out there. And to some degree, they're all right. And we define it as follows. So in our research, looking at many different spiritual traditions, we think compassion refers to the concrete ways that both ultimate, which is sometimes called divine, and human love are expressed. So the various ways that human love and ultimate love are expressed concretely. And so more to the human experience, in its most basic form, compassion is being moved in one's depths by the experiences of another, such that we respond in ways that intend to ease the suffering or promote the flourishing of another. And so this can be directed outwards towards others, and it can be directed inwards towards ourselves. And compassion is important, one, because it's the core skill that grounds our approach to anti-racism, and two, because compassion is how we connect to the truth of who we are. It's how we come to know ourselves as full human beings, worthy of dignity, even in the face of those parts of ourselves that we struggle to love, the parts that we hide from others. It's how we see belovedness in others, even when they can't see it in themselves. And so compassion is the path by which we understand what it means to be fully human with dignity.
And so the second principle that we use in the ways in which we formed our training is the fact that we prioritize self-care and healing from racial trauma. And for us, we believe that empowered compassion really is an invitation to a different way of living that allows us to engage this healing in fundamental ways that's unique not only to the individual, but also recognizes the ways in which healing is going to be different for different races and different groups of people. Some may wonder why you would even integrate or try to integrate compassion and anti-racism. But again, as I said, compassion as we use it really is an invitational, right, response. It's a way to think about how we can engage this world in ways that is fundamentally a different orientation that is not only invitational to ourselves, but to others, but a way that allows us to stay grounded in the realities that we are confronting. Empowered compassion, in this sense, resists structural evil by seeking to humanize ourselves and our neighbors, right? So it's not a way in which we think about anti-racism as dehumanizing the racist, right? Or by ignoring our own particular kinds of trauma and pretending that we are not traumatized. So when we are confronted with the realities of oppression and dehumanization, compassion doesn't seek to deride or call someone out for their actions, nor does compassion seek to turn a blind eye and remain passive and assume that maybe things aren't as bad as they appear. Rather, when confronted with the realities of oppression and dehumanization, compassion allows us to ground ourselves in the realities of these structural evils, such as racism, sexism, heterosexism, and ableism. And it is from this solid ground we're able to see ourselves for who we authentically are, right? So as people of faith, we're talking about seeing ourselves as someone created in the image of God, or someone who has a kind of deep and distinct human dignity. not elevating ourselves as being perfect, but also recognizing that we do have an important value, not only to ourselves, but to others in our communities. And in so doing, we're able to see others for who they are. We're not essentializing them in the one action, perhaps, that they have done that we might say is, in fact, problematic or racist. And in so doing, we are able to invite them into a deeper understanding of the injustice that they have committed. We are able to invite them into a process of helping to create the community that we believe we are all longing for. And so, in this way, compassion forms the core of our humanizing lens through which we view all people. No one should be essentialized, right? We view all people through this lens of compassion. Racism lives, moves, and breathes within the structures we have created because we all have been racialized. And so, in this sense, the words race and racism carry a lot of emotional weight, and we need tools to be able to tend to ourselves and our reactions so that in the process of learning and learning about, or learning and unlearning about race. And what we have come to realize is that the history of nonviolent social transformation shows us that we must have the courage to take the risk of humanizing, quite honestly, ourselves and our neighbors. And the ways in which we believe this humanizing takes place, most importantly, most sustainably, most effectively, is through compassion.
So the third principle is that we have a commitment to an inclusive and humanizing approach. So our commitment isn't rooted in essentialized visions of the black-white binary. And this is another factor that sets us apart from many other approaches to anti-racism. And compassion forms the core of our humanizing lens through which we view all people. No one should be essentialized. No one should be reduced to a single statement they've made, a stake, to a single aspect of their identity, because we all lead intersectional lives. We all have complex identities. And until we can bring that into the learning space, we can't fully participate in a humanizing process. And so we refuse to dehumanize ourselves and others, because basically dehumanizing when you're teaching about dehumanization is self-defeating. We also like to start where people are. And so we honor the fact that learning about racism is a process, and that we all go through it in our own way. So we have to be allowed to honor our own experiences and the trauma that comes with racism. We're all traumatized by racism, but we're not all traumatized in the same way. So we set the space to create community. We foster authenticity to unleash the transformative power of learning that occurs when we are allowed to be ourselves, when we're allowed to be fully present. And as best we can within the time frame of our seminar, we push folks and make space and provide the tools to tend to the stuff that arises from pushing our conceptual boundaries. So we acknowledge the difficult feelings that accompany learning and unlearning about race and racism, and we provide the tools to tend to those feelings. We don't want to make white people feel guilty and shame for being white, and we certainly don't ask white people to apologize for being white. And we don't ask the BIPOC folks that attend our seminars to relive their racial traumas as a way to teach other participants about how racism really functions. So now I think we'll move to a brief overview of our process.
Yeah, so this is kind of the structure of what we'll go through if we can join our seminar over the next few weeks. Again, because we believe racism is dynamic, our process is essentially dynamic. We start with grounding. And by grounding, we mean both being grounded in the reality of race and racism, but also being able to know what it means to be grounded as such, to know what it means for us to be acting in a grounded state or to be acted in a reactive state. And what this does, it allows us to recognize what's coming up within us as we learn these particular kinds of race theories that we engage in throughout our seminar. So grounding is crucial because so often what we find is that people that are, particularly politicians, when they talk about race, they really are standing on shaky ground, if any ground at all, because you have a clear sense that they don't understand some of the fundamental and foundational assumptions about how race works. So that's what we'll be learning in that session. And so the next session we move to, or the next couple of sessions, are around self-compassion. And by self-compassion, we again turn inward and like, what does it mean for us to actually cultivate the processes and practices of cultivating a kind of compassion towards ourselves? And then how do we apply this particular principle in light of the racism, in the ways in which we encounter racism, either as someone who is or has done or racist things, or as someone who's been a victim of racism, right? But both folks need a different kind of self-compassion that's manifested in different ways. Particularly, people who are committed to not being racist, if you're white, need to learn how to turn inward and tend to those parts of you that come up when you realize perhaps the shame and guilt of things you've done in the past or things that we have done in the present. And at the same time, for people of color, how might we heal from, again, some of those traumas that we have inherited? What one of the authors reused calls traumatic retention, in terms of the ways in which we learn to engage in the world, how we have learned to weather the storms of racism. Then we could learn about cultivating compassion for others, right? And so this is a kind of inversion of the traditional anti-racism approach, right? We want to spend time learning about the reactivities that comes up in the other, right? So for people of color, this is about, again, learning about what comes up in white folks when dealing with this, and for white people, about what comes up in Black folks and or people of color, again, and how might we actually develop an empathy and begin an empathic compassion that attempts to understand their own inner worlds. This really is a project of liberation, right, from that kind of logics of dehumanization. It fundamentally starts from a place of anti-oppression that sees us as interconnected. And so we are trying to move away from this hierarchical anti-oppressive model of seeing other human beings to a more integrative, a more interconnected approach that's intersectional, I should also say, that sees us as the complex human beings that we are. And lastly, we then discern compassionate actions. So throughout this process, we will be talking about actions from the beginning. And so that when we get to this step of saying, okay, what might we actually do with respect to compassionate actions, you feel a little bit more equipped to discern what action might be most effective for your particular community and how you might go about doing it. We talk about different pillars that we want you to have, and particular kind of qualities of engagement that we think one should have when engaging and doing an anti-racist compassionate action. Because again, we don't want to stop at compassion for ourselves or compassion for others. It really knows that in order to change the world, we need to engage the world. And then lastly, we need to reassess, right? We need to recognize that things that we've created and things that we're doing are complex, they're difficult, and because racism is so dynamic, we are likely going to have to shift and make some changes and pivot with respect to what we are doing and how we are trying to do it. And so this is the invitation to begin the process. Quite honestly, again, right, to start over and say, okay, how might we actually make this better? Recognizing that there's no one, fix. Because if it was honestly that easy, we wouldn't really have racism at all. So that's our super kind of brief treetops overview of the process. And I think what we like to end with is just saying a little bit about what to expect in the seminar, and then we'll open it up for questions and kind of go from there. So if you sign up for Racial Resilience, what can you expect? Or what should you expect? I could say what we expect as facilitators is faithful engagement in the readings, right? Actually, engaging the materials. That means both doing the readings and doing the contemplative practice, right? Because they go hand in hand in the way we design our process. I would honestly say the contemplative practices are in some, I almost want to say more important, because even if you do a little bit of reading, but you do the practices, there's a particular kind of depth that they hit you with in a different kind of way, and they allow you to better process the stuff that we're going to be engaging. And that's just been our experience, and I would say we know this to be true in terms of the impact and the that our seminar and our training has had on people. And we expect honest participation, and so this requires people to be vulnerable. This is not easy, right? Anti-racism is not easy work in the sense of it's going to feel good in the moment all the time. It will feel good in the long run. You will feel lighter. You'll feel more equipped to engage the work. You will feel more loving and compassionate towards yourself and to others, and you will feel more prepared to engage in these situations. But the process of getting there, it takes work, right? And again, it requires vulnerability that really manifests in courage in that way. And so every week you'll have different practices and different readings that you'll have access to. And we just expect you to be prepared to come to class as best as you are able, so that we can engage the work of compassion-based anti-racism. So that's really our presentation. We wanted to keep this light so we can have time for Q&A, and we know everybody's busy on Saturday mornings. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing here real quick. See if this is not sharing. So I see one question in the chat. Are there scholarships available? I want to retake this course as a refresher, as a class of ideas. I would have to turn you over to, I would say you would email Dale and Shelley, and they'll talk to you about that. We're in charge of teaching. We're not in charge of anything else. Like really, and which is good, because that's not Seth and I's strong suit. So we are very good teachers. But yeah, and actually, you know, Sarah, this version of the course is going to be different. I mean, Seth and I are always tweaking it, and trying to make revisions, and we have
dynamism of the process.
Yeah, and I think some of that's because, again, as we said, racism is so dynamic, you know, and the way what we see happening right now, in institutions has forced us to make some, to make some pivots in terms of how we go about implementing the process, even though the core of it is exactly the same. The layout's going to be a little bit different. That's the best way to say it. And it's nice to see you again, Sarah. Any other? Yeah, you can either put them in the chat, or feel free to just unmute yourself and turn your camera on if you're able, and just ask your question. That's totally fine as well. I would open up and say, so I should also say, first of all, Seth and I are very, because we're contemplative, silence does not bother us at all, because, and we don't get a lot of peace because we have toddlers. And so some say silence is fine. I'm like, I could sit here and just be totally fine. But other than questions, if there are comments, right? So I don't want to just pivot, oh, it has to be just comments, thoughts, anything that's come up for you during this presentation, you're more than welcome to share those too. It doesn't have to be in the form of a question like Jeopardy. Sarah.
It's great to see you guys again. I mean, I started this when we started the pandemic. I mean, I can't believe it's been 2 years.
Yeah.
Two. My gosh. I mean, but it's always important to get refreshed and renewed in anti-racism training, because it's an ongoing thing. It's lifelong. And I'm part of the Poor People's Campaign, and I'm really, it's interlocking. So important. Thank you guys so much. And I will be in contact with you, Dale. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. It is good to see you.
I did just want to encourage Seth to take a look at a note that I put in the chat for him. Also wanted to reach out to y'all just for a second to recognize that the work we do is with individuals and with organizations and with communities. The work we do is not inexpensive. And so one of the things we're always trying to create is partnerships with organizations, churches, government organizations, nonprofits, mental health groups that we've been able to create relationships with to help further this work. I would really encourage those of you who are connected to larger communities to do some conversation with them about how, as a group, you might begin learning the skills of self-compassion and compassion for others, and how we can use compassionate action in becoming anti-racist individuals and communities. So I just wanted to put that out there. You have my email from the communications that we've shared with one another, but please do connect with us. If you believe your organization would like to be partners with us in this work.